cars. Okay. Now, this is a model of a relatively modern streetcar, and I'll be talking about that in some detail. Now, we talk about the horse and buggy age, but I think it's much more accurate to refer to the streetcar or trolley car age because I'm talking about 100 years ago. Well, it actually started in the 1880s, 1890s. Most people did not have horse and buggies, especially in the cities, which were growing fantastically in those days. Couldn't afford it, a horse and a rig and everything. But the streetcar, here it comes in something that for a nickel you can go all around the city. Now, of course, they had the subways and elevated trains were really coming in then. In fact, the first elevated trains were steam powered, and the first trolley cars were cable cars, and not just in San Francisco either. Many, I would say, all American big cities by the turn of the century, that is the 19th to 20th century, had cable cars as well. Well, the event, the trolley cars, it was a really cheap alternative to um, to having to have your own horse and rig, and of course for the cities that were built. Well, actually, I should point all of this: the streetcars, the elevated trains, the subways were all private as a way of making money in those days over public transportation because people lived close together in the cities and the suburbs that were just well kind of place for wealthy people really could afford to take the train out there. So it was a big step forward. Another big step forward was when they went over from the horse-drawn cars to the electric cars for obvious reasons. Turn of the I keep saying turn of the century. That shows my age, I guess. That the experts, they had it all figured out that in the next decade or less, even New York will be under like 10, 15, 20 feet of horse manure. Okay. And so, for many reasons, that was one advantage of the automobile is that it doesn't drop this stuff all over the place, just that innocent stuff coming out the tailpipe, and that won't hurt you. But anyway, getting back to actually streetcars themselves, one of the problems they faced and made it a little later to come in more like in the 1890s and 1880s was that the problem of the gears. Now you see, it's not just even though on rails, it's not that smooth, and so the gears are together. But if they hit a bump, the gears will jam or get pop out and that type of thing. And it took quite a while, but a professor of electrical engineering at the Naval Academy decided let's try with springs and see springs could keep the gears engaged even though unless there's a major bump, and they weren't. I mean, the tracks were fairly level, and that just opened up streetcars. And the thing is incredible, what I call about the streetcar age was that I mean, every single city in America had them, a network of them. Even smaller places like Oklahoma City, Fayetteville, North Carolina, even had a streetcar line for a while. So I mean, they're just everywhere, and certainly that's why I keep insisting it was the streetcar age. And of course, I'm old enough to remember, streetcars like, for example, the city of Philadelphia, all over the place. Well, they really began to make money, and I say they're owned by private companies. And what would happen? Investors, entrepreneurs would approach the municipal government and bribe or talk them into giving them a contract. And then they have the right to lay track and run in that area. And not just they didn't just make money; they had to give something back. And that was in the northern cities. They had to do all the snow removal, and and even in the southern cities, they had to often do a lot of street cleaning. They had the actual trolleys equipped with brushes and so on to sweep. That's a sweetheart deal, and for 5 cents. Although I should point out that there was a mayor of Philadelphia back in the 30s that 5 cents is too high. You elect me, and I'll bring the cost down. Well, he didn't, but I mean, I thought 5 cents, that's too high a fare. And the other thing about it, since it was private, if you didn't use it, you didn't have to pay for it. Okay, there are people say I don't live around there, and whatever I've got a horse or something. But today, when they lay down what they call light rail, now that's the modern word for it. It's always run by the government because no private investor will take it on, and so a lot of people say they got to pay their taxes for the trolley line or a light rail line that they'll never use. But they say, well, you don't have any kids, but you still have to pay your school taxes. So I mean, that's a debate that we can have. But I think it's remarkable. Private industry has all over the country, and not all over the country, but all over the world. I mean, that's the word tram is actually from the British. I can't think of again all over the world, whether it's Calcutta or London or Paris, they had streetcars. So and again, all run by private companies, by private entrepreneurs. And it was so the height of the streetcar would be 1929, and by then, of course, Henry Ford's Model T. You see, a lot of people could afford that, and they didn't have to feed it when it wasn't running. And of course, it didn't make any pollution, as you know. But you always think about the Model T and the Model A. You hear the racket those things make. Can you imagine what it was like in the cities with thousands, tens of thousands of these things going around? But that's another story. Um, 19 Henry Ford, the Model T was the first blow the streetcars suffered, but their peak year was 1929. If you'll excuse me just for a minute, 1929. Then the Depression came along, and people just didn't have work. They weren't going anywhere, and so the attendance, the ridership really went down, and also they felt that the streetcars are getting old now. We need a modern, up to date streetcar that doesn't make the racket that the old streetcars made. And what happened? Here, we often say that something is designed by committee. It doesn't really work. But here you had all this, not all, but all the big streetcar company presidents got together and said, let's make a modern streetcar. And this is what they came up with. It's called the President's Conference, PCC car. And I mean, even today that looks good and modern. Now, it didn't have air conditioning, but aside from that, it could run today. And as a matter of fact, San Francisco has, I would say, scores of these older they bought from other dumb cities that got rid of their streetcars, and it was fast, it was quiet, and of course it didn't pollute. So anything that good, it's going to die. Well, so of course the Depression, a lot of these companies went out of business, and then the federal government, began to build more roads, put people to work. Just like in Germany, they built the Autobahn to put people to work, and it was a serial policy against railroads. Going back to the old progressive days when the railroads were the robber barons, and that kind of went over to the streetcars as well. It's private, and they're gouging people, charging them 5 cents to ride the streetcar. And the government really encouraged a highway building program. Almost nothing for streetcars, all because, well, they're private. Who wants them? So it was downhill, a brief uphill bleep during the war, when we realized, hey, these things don't burn gasoline. So they run electricity, and we can make a lot of electricity in this country. So the real boom during the war. But as soon as the war was over, post-war prosperity, the move to the suburbs really hurt the streetcar companies. Move to the suburbs was a really, in a way, you could argue that was the single most lasting detriment for the streetcars, because the houses are all scattered now, and it's just too expensive to run railroad, the rails and the wire all over to Shady Dale Acres and Lakeview Village and whatever. So scattered. So the streetcars really couldn't make a profit. And what happens? All the streetcar private companies died, and then that's the end of it. I would say 1985 was about the low point of streetcars. I think there were like four cities that still ran streetcars. I'll tell you one city that never really got rid of the streetcars, Toronto, Ontario, and today they still have a wonderful system. They're very, in fact, Toronto's always been pro rail, pro streetcar. And I remember even the old days how they just all over the place, these wonderful streetcars, most of them being, of course, the PCC cars. Matter of fact, after a while, these were the only trolley cars that were running in this country. I mean, you're talking 50 years later. Now you're talking 80 years later. They're still running in San Francisco and a few other, Canada. How do you spell it? Kenosha, Wisconsin has a little streetcar line of its own. I think it's mostly for tourists, but still, those cars must be 85 years old and they're still running. Do you know a bus that's 50, 60, 70, 80 years old? No? Okay. But people thought, well, the municipalities, well, the buses, they're flexible, and you don't have to lay down track and wire and everything, and they can just go anywhere. And who cares about pollution? I mean, or the noise. I remember when I was at Columbia, I was up on the 7th floor, student residence, and they had buses down on Amsterdam Avenue, very slight incline, and that could wake you up. And it was so loud, not to mention the exhaust coming out. But they were originally streetcar lines at Amsterdam Avenue. Get rid of them, put on buses, and but then things started to happen. People began to think, we're just going overboard with these cars and with these buses, and pollution. It started to get in. And again, Canada, Calgary, I believe, first line in 1989, something like that. And that kind of began to open. People are saying, look, we're drowning in pollution. All these building more highways and bypasses to bypasses and whatever. And the flexibility of the bus they talked about. Well, yeah, but you might have a business on a bus line, but then they'll move the bus line. Whereas when the trolley line is there, it's probably going to stay. They're not going to rip the rails and the wiring and go somewhere else. So there was a real revival which has taken place today. And I would say now, and I've done a fair amount of research on this, mostly through the web, that I don't think there's one city of any size that has is not at least planning for streetcars. I think one city, Rochester, they had a beautiful system. One of the complaints about the streetcar was it couldn't pull over to the curb. You have to get out in the street to pick up the car. It's not flexible. Well, they had a private right of way in Rochester, but back in 1956, they said, well, it kind of gets in the way of the superhighway here, and they got rid of it. And they've never brought it back. Rochester, city that's just about big enough to have a streetcar line now, but they still haven't got the message. But I would say almost every other city of any size is at least seriously thinking about putting in streetcar like that. It's called light rail now. That's considered more modern. Everything is streetcar. When that sort of sounds old fashioned. We're not the only ones. It's just the Americans with our car mania or anything. In fact, I think the British love their cars more than we do. There were something like 6 or 7 special English car companies that made sports cars, and we had between 1936 or so till the Ford Mustang came out. We didn't have any, and they really. I figured out that there is no horizontal electric transportation in Great Britain after or the whole United Kingdom after 1962, when the Glasgow trackless trolleys, I'll talk about them in a minute, they gave out and said, well, they had commuter lines, sure, heavy rail, but no light rail. Every one of them got rid of them. I think the French did also. I'm not sure about it. The Germans didn't give it up. For some reason, they kept them going. And one of the arguments they use is, well, we don't have any fuel. I mean, gasoline, electricity is expensive. Well, the Germans, they the same thing as the French, but in the English, but they kept theirs going. So all this getting away from the trolley cars is nothing unique to America. As a matter of fact, the president of France, Pompidou, said that the city must adapt to the automobile. Well, we said just the opposite. The automobile is adapted to the city now. I don't think there's been a new freeways built in the last 10 years, thank goodness. So there's been a real movement back to the streetcar and the trolley car for many reasons. Certainly pollution, the way that the vast amount of land that's taken over by the automobile. And then I say the bus is a pretty pathetic excuse for transportation. Now, out in the suburbs, beyond, yeah, we have to use buses, but even in the suburbs, they had a great compromise between the bus and the streetcar called different names also, trackless trolley or trolley bus. And these were they had the ability to go over to the curb. Also, if there's like a blockage, a truck that's broken down on the street, you can go around it. Okay, and so Philadelphia still has a line of trackless, and I think San Francisco and maybe Seattle, and they're building them again now also, and I believe England also, or Great Britain England itself actually has brought a few back. But as I say, this was not a uniquely American stupidity, getting rid of our wonderful electric trolley lines. All over the world, they did that, except for one city, Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne, because apparently it was a flat territory and it was wide streets, they laid down track for trolley cars and they kept them. Amazing. Another interesting point about is Hong Kong, which is in the news for other reasons, but they have double-decker trolley cars, which of course the English had, the famous London trams, which they got rid of course, in 1952. But they're still running in Hong Kong. I hope the political problems there won't see the end of it. They're tourist attractions. The English also had double-decker trolley buses as well, because it's a tight little line with lots of people in it. So that made sense as well. So we're living in the sort of the opening, the dawn, if you will, be dramatic, of a light rail renaissance. And I'm heralding it. Glad to see it. So I just want to show you it again. The famous PCC car, the President's Conference Commission car, was designed in the early 1930s, and it is still running today in fairly large numbers in San Francisco. In fact, San Francisco bought, as I said before, trolleys from other cities that were dumb enough to get rid of them, and kept the old paint. So you see trolley cars in San Francisco with Philadelphia transportation colors on it, or green cars from Boston. Boston, another city, by the way, did get rid of all their trolley cars. They worked at it, but they have about four at the bottom of the pit. That was about four cities that somehow kept them going until the end. Well, on that happy note, we get a lot of bad news today, but that's a happy note. The trackless trolley bus renaissance. Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.